Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of today, of the second day of the course. Welcome also to everyone who is joining the session online through the live stream with socialprotection.org. And we're very happy to have you here. Just before we start the session, I just wanted to flag something to all of you, highlight something that I'm sure you've been aware of. I'm not sure that the camera for the live stream we'll be able to see this, but every day, Sarah, who I think is hiding behind here, is doing the graphic recording of the sessions and the content, which I'm sure many of you have noticed, but I think it's a really nice way to see the highlights of the various discussions and a kind of visualization of those. So please do remember to come along and have a look and reflect. So thank you very much to Sarah for that. I think they're fantastic. Also, you would have all been sent a link yesterday, which is to a kind of another form of storytelling, a kind of a photo story of yesterday, of the course, using Exposure. It's kind of online photo storytelling platform. So please do have a click on that link, and you can see some of the excellent photos that Jacopo and the other Sarah, who's also been taking photos, have been taking every day, and you can see a spot if you've been included. Okay, so let's now move on with the session today. And the session this morning is really going to focus on the question of the impact of social protection. The idea of this session is really to provide a snapshot of what is the kind of latest evidence on the kinds of impacts that social protection can have. I think this is important partly from a kind of pragmatic policy development perspective. You know, if we can better understand the nature of impacts of different kinds of social protection programs, we can better design those programs. We can better implement those programs. But at the same time, I think we've seen yesterday many questions and discussions coming up around, the fiscal space for social protection, whether governments can really finance them, whether there's really the political will and commitment. And I think a lot of this evidence on impact can help us in our role, often not just as technocrats, but as advocates as well, to convince others within government, within society, to fund social protection. So, first of all, we're delighted to have on this topic of impacts, a panel with a huge amount of experience of studying the impacts of social protection. We have Frank and Maxine, who joined us yesterday, so you're already familiar with them. But also we have joining us Luca and Jessica. So Luca Pellerano is the Chief Technical Advisor on Social Security in the ILO, based in Lusaka in Zambia. And has, as well as that experience and within the ILO world, also spent many, many years working on impact assessment of social protection schemes, including having a leading role in Oxford Policy Management, which is one of the organizations that's been very involved in a wide number of impact evaluations on social protection programs. Now, Jessica Jean-Francois is a colleague of Josh, who we all met yesterday, a senior associate at Ideas 42, and working on the social protection and productive inclusion programs in sub-Saharan Africa within Ideas 42, and managing a number of pieces of research. Also, prior to joining Ideas 42, Jessica was on a team at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative overseeing the external evaluation of a three-year program implemented in 10 countries aimed at strengthening local capacity to prepare and respond to disasters and emergencies. So again, a real depth of experience on analysis of impact of social protection and other kinds of programs. So just to give a sense of how we're going to run this session, we're not going to have kind of a number of set very formal presentations. We're more going to have a bit of a discussion here. But also, as well as showcasing and providing opportunity for some of our panelists to share the things that particularly interest them, we really want to make this an opportunity for all of you to ask the questions that interest you. You know, what are the kind of impacts you'll be interested to know about? areas of impact. Does social protection impact X, Y? How does it do so? So we're going to try and create a good amount of space to hear those questions and answer them. So I would suggest that right away, if you have both questions around impact that you'd like to know more about, please start to ask them through the Slido. And similarly, if you have specific questions on some of the things that our panelists discuss, then also please put them up, and we'll try and give a good amount of time to working through those questions and hear a little bit more from you guys in the audience about your own experiences. Okay, so I think there's all of my starting items. Yes, so the question I wanted to start off with, I'm going to ask the same question to everyone, was really from your experiences. I'll start with you, Frank. What is the kind of impact that has most struck you from your research, from your work on assessing the impact of social protection? What's the one thing where you've really thought, wow, that's seriously impressive?
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm the social policy specialist with UNICEF, also working on the transfer project, which is this collaboration between FAO, UNICEF, and then the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we've been evaluating cash transfer programs in several countries in Sub-Saharan Africa: Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and also in Ethiopia. And I would say one of the things that struck me the most is the multiplier effect of the cash transfers that we do. So say you give a typical household a transfer of $1, and then you record an impact of $1.42, which means you've been able to turn around the money that you give them, and the impact is far in excess of the amount that you give them. So that's something that has struck me, that the money doesn't just go straight into expenses or consumption. It goes into productive activities, and you're able to turn it around and multiply it and return sometimes 42%, 32% returns on the money that you give them as an impact, which is something that's very important for us to think about. Yep.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so Luca, what about you? I think you...
Yeah, I wanted to talk about something related to what Frank was just mentioning, the issue of the multiplier. So Frank was saying there is a multiplier, let's say, in the pockets of the beneficiaries as they use their monies to invest in productive activities. But there is also another. Sorry.
It's on the side. Kind of scroll it down.
Oops. Now I went somewhere I shouldn't be. So there's also another interesting dimension of the economic multiplier, which is what we call the local economy multiplier as well. So this picture kind of describes to you a situation where you see it's supposed to be animated, but you see on the top, I think to you is what, top left, an household receiving a cash transfer. Beneficiary household receiving monetary cash in their pockets. And you see how that cash transfers through economic linkages in the community. So you see that money is bought in the local market at the center to buy goods and services that are produced by other members of that same community, at least to some extent. So the benefits of the cash actually feed through economic linkages and have an impact which is much broader than on that direct beneficiary household, but actually spill over. That's why we say the spillover, economic spillover to many other households that produce goods and services in those communities, as well as in the neighboring communities. Eventually, that money will go out of the local economy. But what some recent studies have looked at is to try and estimate and kind of model how much of the initial cash injection stays in the local economy and fosters, enhances, generates opportunities for production within local households, who are producing goods and services for in response to the additional demand that cash transfer generates. And I think some of us, I would say particularly in the African context, can very much relate to a situation where, on payday, when the cash transfers are on payment, informal markets gather around the payment points. That's a very kind of vivid illustration of how strong these local economy impacts can be, and the impact that cash transfers have not only on beneficiaries but on the economy. So some recent studies have tried to look at, quantify the size of this impact on the local economy multiplier. So here, and this is a recent study from Malawi, you see we looked at 4 different programs: the social cash transfer, the public works program, the fertilizer input support program, which is is kind of an input subsidy program in two versions. And the orange bars are the nominal multiplier. The real bars are reflecting the real multiplier, meaning they are adjusted for inflation, because as we also know, injecting cash in a local economy can generate some level of inflation. So these all results from a model. And what you see is that across the board, no matter what of these programs you look at, there are kind of different forms of social protection programs, they all generate in the economy much more than the $1 which is put in the pockets of the beneficiaries. So we estimate local economy multipliers that range from 1.5 to 2.4, meaning that for every dollar in the pockets of the beneficiaries, between $0.50 and $1.50 additional income is generated in the economy through those economic linkages. Now, what is interesting is that I would say particularly for the public works program, the impact very much, the local economy impact very much depend on whether those public works programs actually make a contributions towards improving productivity in the rural economy. And we could discuss that. There is a lot of debate as to whether public works are a good tool to actually build assets and transfer skills so that productivity increases. But of course, when programs not only improve demand, but also operate on the supply side to actually enhance productivity of poor and vulnerable households in those communities, such as public works does, or such as also, in this case, the input subsidy intends to do, then the economy multipliers are even larger. There is not only a demand effect, but is also an improvement in productivity so that other households in those communities can better respond to that increased demand. And the other thing I wanted to share with you is this slide, which actually now breaks down the local economy impact by sector, but also by beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries. So what you see here is very clearly that the economic spillovers, first of all, benefit primarily the non-beneficiaries. So you see that the green bars are always higher than the orange bars. That means that those who capture those economic spillover, those opportunities for increased economic activities in the communities are generally the non-beneficiaries. Why is it so? Because they are less poor, less vulnerable, they are in a position to, they are running small businesses, they are in a position to capture that additional demand. So in a way, the benefit of cash goes beyond the beneficiaries and benefits even non-beneficiary households through these economic linkages. And then you see also by sector that economic linkages are very much concentrated on the retail sector. In this case, we're looking at the production multipliers. So you see that in this case, in percentage terms, have been a 93% increase in the value of production in the retail sector. When we looked at Malawi. This is particularly on the social cash transfer, but also to some extent an increase in crop production, and also to some extent an increase in the service sector. So that, I think, it gives us a bit of kind of an overview as to the importance of looking not just at the impact on the household, on the beneficiaries, but also how cash transfers and social protection programs more generally have a broader economic impact. And what we have seen in the region, I'm speaking mostly about Africa because it's where I work and it's a reason I know better. We've seen that, for example, ministries of finance are very much sensitive to this type of arguments because really it kind of reinforces the point that social protection is about poverty and vulnerability reduction, but also can have kind of positive effects also in terms of economic growth, which are very clear from when we look at the local economy multipliers as I've just shown to you.
Great, thanks, Luca. Just one moment. I'm pleased we already have a number of questions coming through. Unfortunately, the panelists can't see them, but I can. And we'll be working through them more in a second. But we did just have one that I thought maybe you'd like to respond to, Luca, which was somebody saying, so the cash transfer brings 30% inflation?
Okay, so this one I think refers to this slide. Let me just make a clarification. This data is based on a model, so it's a simulation exercise if you want. So this is not based on empirical results. What we did is we developed a model that describes the local economy, in this case the rural economy in Malawi, both supply and demand side, and then production and consumption, and then we effectively shocked that model by simulating what would be the impact of a program. In this case, let's take the social cash transfer. And of course, the model considers the possibility of inflation coming into place. So the model allows for inflation to be, to result as a consequence of an increased, availability of funds in that community. Which is not to say that when we look at the empirical data, we find evidence of inflation. So let's say the model provides for that case that inflation may be generated in the economy, and that's why what we focus is more the real multiplier rather than the nominal multiplier. We want to see how, the purchasing power of beneficiaries has actually, translated in their capacity to buy goods and services. But as I say, this is a model. It doesn't mean that in practice we have empirical evidence that actually there are inflationary effects. As a matter of fact, I think when we look at the transfer project, they also looked at the issues of inflation, and maybe Frank could speak a bit to that, but actually we don't see any evidence of inflation for cash transfers in Africa. And why the model does it, why would there be inflation in the local economy? There would be inflation if you want, the supply is rigid, meaning that there is no capacity for local producers to respond to that additional demand. But what we see in Africa, even in very rural communities and villages in Africa, that actually supply is quite elastic, meaning that it is possible for the local markets to respond to that additional demand. And so we see that actually businesses are mushrooming, popping up. Traders are moving to the villages at time of payment, meaning that we have a very elastic supply and there is a capacity to absorb demand, and therefore we don't see inflationary effects. Although the model provides for that option, we actually don't see it when we look at the empirical data. Also because remember that the share of beneficiaries in total population is generally relatively small, and also the amount of this transfer is relatively small. But most importantly, because, as we say, the supply side is capable of reaching and increasing capacity to produce goods and services to beneficiaries.
Okay, thanks very much, Luca. Okay, Jessica, it'd be great if you could share, an impact that you found particularly striking for one of you.
And so, as you mentioned, our work at Ideas 42 applies behavioral science and the behavioral lens to support policies and programs to be able to have a greater impact at a lower cost by thinking about the decisions and actions that the beneficiaries have to make in order to participate in the program and get the most out of the program. And so what's really struck me is how small interventions and design features can lead to actually pretty strong impact in terms of outcomes for beneficiaries. So I just want to share one example of some work that we've done in Mexico around retirement savings and pensions. So in Mexico, the nationwide system for retirement savings, like many places, although there is a contribution from the employers, it requires that beneficiaries and participants actually make voluntary contributions in order to get the most out of the program and in order to have a comfortable retirement. And so what we saw was a new policy in Mexico around making it easier and more accessible for people to make contributions or returning low outcomes. And so with the implementation of the policy, less than 1% of the people with the, of the account holders for retirement savings were actually making contributions per year to their retirement savings. And so this is a big issue because in their retirement, they were receiving less than 40% of their salaries to be able to live on. And in Mexico at the time, 27% of the elderly were living in poverty. And so using the behavioral lens, we were able to suggest some designs to the account statements in order to produce some impact. So traditionally, you might think, okay, so if they're, the account holders are not making contributions to their retirement savings account, maybe they're your traditional reasons for why this happens. So maybe there's not enough money to contribute to the account, which could be true and is at times true. Maybe they need more incentives to save, and maybe even saving needs to be mandatory. But through the behavioral lens, we also know globally that people face some behavioral barriers in order to make their retirement savings, and we all face the same issue, right? We might make the intention to save, but never get around to do it, like many other things. We might think that retirement is way too far away, and that it's not something that we want to think about right now. We'll think about it later. Maybe we can make larger contributions later in time to be able to catch up to the ones that we miss now. Or maybe we see our present needs, the things that are right in front of us, to be more important than the needs of the future and planning for the future. Or even maybe the savings behaviors around us, the way that we see the savings behavior, no one else is saving, so why should I save? And these are the things that we see globally. And so applying that behavioral lens to the system of retirement savings in Mexico, we were able to produce some impact in terms of savings behavior. And so you'll see here just some simple design features of account statements that were able to lead to these increases. And so on the top in this form, this is a redesign of the account savings quarterly statements. You see on the top right, you have a thermometer that clearly suggests to the account holders where they are in their savings health to quickly prompt them to act and know and be informed of where they are in a visual and clear way. You see in the middle photos that prompt the account holders to think about their goals for the future and cue them to think about their savings today, and that everyone should be thinking about their savings. And lastly, in the same form, you have a simple checklist where we've framed it in the way where one simple action could help you to decide to make the contribution right away in a simple 3-step process. And so these design interventions to the savings have produced 40% increase in savings behavior. And it's just an example of how small design interventions through the behavioral lens could produce some impact.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Okay, on to Maxine. That would be.
If you can find that.
Yep.
Great.
Perfect.
Well, hello everybody. Yesterday I mentioned one of the things that I'd been very struck by doing research in 5 countries in Africa and the Middle East in particular, but also in Latin America, and that was that programs that were meant to address extreme poverty were often missing, some of them more extremely poor. Today I want to talk about some of the more positive things we found in our research, and I want to focus actually on the psychosocial benefits that participants in the cash transfer programs stressed very strongly that they had experienced significant changes in their attitudes towards life in a whole range of areas as a result of being part of the program and receiving the cash. So that emerged as one of our most strongest findings across the 5 countries that we were looking at in the Middle East and Africa. And to unpack that a little bit, it turned on things like people saying they felt more self-esteem as a result of receiving the cash. They didn't have to beg and borrow. The fact that they were once again integrated into their communities and had a certain degree of respect meant that they had escaped the terrible shame of poverty. And I think that tells us something about the experience that people have of poverty as much as it does of what cash transfers do to relieve some of that. There were other things that were mentioned. For example, women mentioned that, and so did men, that it was important that they were creditworthy once again, that they were trusted by shopkeepers to be able to pay back money that they'd had not been able to settle when they were in times of great hardship. And another psychosocial effect, which I think is worth mentioning because it's a kind of social multiplier. And I don't think anyone's done any research yet on the social multiplier effects of cash transfers, but certainly there is evidence that if you give cash to an individual, there are family spillover effects of a positive kind. And we have actually found that in regard to, for example, adolescence, where the sort of effect of receiving the cash in the household reduces stress. It reduces stress on adolescents, stress on women. There's less violence. I think I mentioned that yesterday. So again, it speaks to the condition of poverty as much as it does to what cash transfers can help relieve. But in terms of what I call social multiplier effects, we also have seen in some cash transfers that there's a rise in social capital and social participation in the program, even if it's only going together to collect the stipend or going together to market day to spend it. These are things that people can begin to do collectively. They get to know people, they get to talk to neighbors, and so forth. So again, there is some evidence of an increase in social capital and the ability, again, to rejoin the community, to make contact with other people in that community. I think one of the things that was interesting too in this area is that although cash transfers don't succeed in removing the problem of stigma, particularly if they are very strongly targeted, nonetheless, what was very interesting in some of the research that we did is that the stigma effect was variable. In other words, some cash transfers were much more accepted than others. People didn't question, for example, the fact that senior citizens in Uganda receiving the senior citizen grant would receive this money. They thought it was perfectly appropriate because older people didn't have access to new forms of generating income. And also, we found that the Orphans and Vulnerable Children program in Kenya likewise had a lot of support from the community in the sense that it was regarded as entirely justifiable. In terms, of course, of the spillover effects with programs given to older people and given to carers of orphans, we found quite a lot of positive benefits accruing to those who received the cash transfer beyond the individual who was receiving it. And we know that from a lot of research in Africa that old people's pensions or grants are shared within the household, and that's another form of social spillover as much as an economic spillover. So a few final points. One was that most people seem to welcome the fact that they were receiving direct payments through technology where this was possible, either directly through their phones or through bank accounts. Although many said they still wanted to have some face-to-face contact with officials. And so I think there's an interesting issue to look into there about, again, connections between people, and technology doesn't always solve all those needs. And lastly, people were very positive, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, about being asked about their views, about participating in PM&E processes. They wanted opportunities to give their feedback to program organizers, officials, and investigators. So I think all of those things we found were as a result of this qualitative research in these countries. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Maxine. I'll come back to that. It was interesting you raised the point on some of the targeting and the influence that can have on some of the outcomes. There have been a few questions coming in through already on that issue that we may come back to. And interesting, I think, to see some commonality or kind of a theme, particularly around this question of multipliers at different levels, the household, the local, the social, coming through in that discussion. Okay, I now wanted to ask you all to just dig a little bit deeper on a few issues that I know you've been researching in some more detail. So we're going to start with you, Frank. I'm aware that the transfer project has been looking a lot at a number of the kind of common perceptions about, or concerns really, about cash transfers and social protection. So things like, will beneficiaries just spend the money on alcohol and tobacco? Will it lead them to dependency and laziness, or so some of these concerns? And it'd be interesting just to have your summary of some of the results coming out of that.
Okay, so I think we also saw some of these questions coming up from the sessions yesterday, and maybe starting from where Luca left off with the issue of inflation and price distortion in the communities. So in each of the countries that we've conducted these impact evaluations, we collect prices of all items from the local markets in both treatment and then control communities. And over time, try to compare the prices to see whether the inflation in treatment communities is different from the inflation in the control communities. And in all the countries, we've now found evidence of differential inflation in the different communities. That means the cash transfer is not inducing excess inflation in beneficiary communities. So that concern that the cash transfer will induce excess inflation in beneficiary communities, so far, from all the research we've done, we've not found evidence to that effect that it creates excess inflation or price distortion. Another concern, especially in Africa, is being that when we give this cash transfer, it will lead to excess expenditure on alcohol and tobacco, especially if you are giving the money to the meal. And again, all the countries that we have done our impact studies, we've not seen excess expenditure on alcohol and tobacco. So again, that myth that giving cash transfer would induce higher expenditure on alcohol and tobacco. And this is very rigorous data that we collect at the household level and also at the community level on the total supplies of alcohol, and also at the household level on the expenditure on alcohol and tobacco. So far, we've not found any evidence of increased expenditure on alcohol and tobacco. Again, as UNICEF, we care about the welfare of children and women. So some of the transfer is aimed at improving the welfare of children. And one of the concerns was that this will lead to increased fertility. That if you are giving cash based on women having children, then it's going to lead to increased fertility for people to try and get more cash because they have more children. And again, from all the studies we've done, we've not found any impact on fertility from the cash transfer, that beneficiary households are giving birth to more kids in order to get more cash transfer. That also doesn't happen. Then the question of whether it will create dependency, so labor supply will go down when people begin to get cash. We actually found evidence to the opposite side, that beneficiary households tend to engage more in productive activities. Now, they are able to buy more of the agricultural tools that they need. They're able to venture into previously economic activities that they did not have. So for instance, you see households that get a cash transfer starting non-farm enterprises. Households that were not engaged in livestock beginning to raise livestock. So they become more economically active, and then they spend more time doing the economic activities. So again, the fear of cash transfer inducing dependency, we don't have any evidence to that effect in all the countries that we have done these impact evaluations. And also about whether the cash is fully consumed, which is my earlier point. They don't fully consume the cash. They actually invest in some of these productive activities. So in the nutshell, the other question is about the physical sustainability of these cash transfer programs. And as was coming up yesterday, if the government has the commitment and has the will and see cash transfer as necessary, and it's an investment in not only the beneficiaries, but also in the local economy in some form, then it can always be sustained. So this is kind of the big picture. We see the positive effects on consumption, on schooling, on health-seeking behavior, on subjective well-being, on on children's material well-being, and also on accumulation of household assets and household durable goods. And also we don't see all the myths that people have about increasing fertility, increasing alcohol and tobacco consumption. We don't have any impacts to this, which is quite refreshing. So the next time you are confronted with any of these potential myths about cash transfer inducing any of these things, you can be sure we have all our materials online. Our impact evaluation methodologies are online, and you can refer anybody to examine that. We don't see these impacts as people fear. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Frank, for summarizing some of the actual evidence on those common perceptions, common myths around social protection and cash transfers. Much of the discussion so far, I think, has been around impacts on individuals, households, families, communities at a kind of more local level. But I know, Luca, you've been doing a lot of work and thinking around some of the impacts at a macro level of social protection. So it'd be great if you could summarize some of those for us.
Yeah, so I think we all have heard a lot about the impact that social protection has on beneficiaries' livelihoods, poverty of the beneficiaries, and so many of the other issues that Frank was referring to, human capital accumulation, productivity. So now I think the question I wanted to try and bring to you from two perspectives is, okay, but what about a country as a whole? What about an economy as a whole? So if you go to this slide shows the overall impact on poverty in two countries, the Philippines and South Africa, of the combination of grants that those two countries have in place, social protection programs. So if we start by South Africa, you see the poverty. So each of the colored lines gives you the impact of poverty of the different components of the South Africa grant system. And as you know, South Africa is one of the countries in Africa with one of the most developed grant social assistance systems. So you see that each of those slices is a slice to poverty that each of those programs takes away in South Africa. So that the poverty line, the poverty distribution across age groups, which is what you see there, would have been as for the top line, but because of the existence of a series of grants, it is as low as the gray line. That's how you read this graph. So you can see that, for example, the green, which is the old age grant, takes away a big chunk of poverty. I mean, poverty rate would have been as high as 60% for the more elderly cohorts of the population, and as a combination of big contribution from the old age grant, but also contributions to some extent of the child grant and the disability grant, it is as low as 20%. So you can see how overall in South Africa, the combination of the existing grants makes a very significant dent on poverty. It's a completely different poverty landscape, the one you see in South Africa, compared to the one that you would see in the absence of the grant system. It's a major redistributive effects, but also it's a major effect on the poverty profile of this country. Compared to the Philippines, you see that the impact, which is the red line of the cash transfer, the Pantawid cash transfer in the Philippines, it is much more reduced. Of course, this is a combination of many factors which we could discuss. It's coverage, it's the value of the beneficiaries, is the logic to the social transfers model, household base versus individual base. At the end of the story, it's a matter of the size of the resource envelope that is made available to social protection. So you see at the top that South Africa, at the time, these graphs, which by the way were produced by Stephen Kidd, were produced, was spending 3.4% of GDP compared to less than 0.4% of GDP in the Philippines. So these programs can have an impact not only on poverty for the beneficiaries, but let's say the overall poverty profile in a given country. It's massive in the case of South Africa. But the point I want to make, Charles, if you go to the next slide, is that sometimes we look at social protection, I feel a bit in isolation, so we don't really see the connection between the social protection system, what we call the benefit system, and the tax system. So I just wanted to spend a minute or two on this. So what you see here, if you stick to the color boxes on your left, you see that what we have is an original distribution of income. So this is the income that is distributed in society as a result of how the economy works in the absence of any transfers. And then that original income translates into disposable income. Disposable income is what people actually have in their pockets. And that's a result of two things: the benefits they receive. Disposable income increases if you receive a grant. If you receive a grant of $100, your disposable income is higher by $100. But also your disposable income is lower, or could be lower, if you pay taxes or if you pay Social Security contributions. So out of your gross income, you may be taken away 20% on income tax, meaning your actual money to spend is 20% lower. So you see already how the distribution of disposable income is affected not just by the social protection side, but also by the tax side. And finally, what matters is post-fiscal income, which is further affected by indirect taxes. So imagine there is a tax, 20% VAT on petrol. Your money the money in your pockets cannot buy 100% of what you have, but can only buy 80% because part of what you actually spend at the petrol station goes into VAT. All right. So what it actually makes households' capacity to buy goods and services is a combination of the transfers, direct taxes, and indirect taxes. So I want to show you the next slide where we see, again, for South Africa, what's the combined impact of social protection and taxes on disposable income, meaning on poverty. And here we look at poverty calculated by the number of households living with less than $1.9 a day across a number of African countries. This is, again, based on simulations. So this is something which is based on what we call micro-simulation, or tax benefit simulation. So let's look at South Africa. The original distribution of income in South Africa without any of transfers or taxes would lead to a poverty rate of 35%. So 35% would be poor if we stuck to like market incomes, the incomes that market generates in the absence of any corrective measures. And you can see how the combination of those grants that I was showing to you before leads poverty to drop from 35% to about 12.9%. It's a major drop. So it's a significant reduction in poverty that results as a consequence of the transfers. But what is interesting to see is that the post-fiscal income, when we look at post-fiscal income, poverty is actually higher than when we look at disposable income. So what is happening there? What happens is that indirect taxes increase poverty rates in South Africa, because indirect taxes, say VAT, affect the poor more than the rich in a distributional point, from a distributional standpoint. So you see that as a result of taxes and benefits, the effects on poverty are slightly reduced because of the regressive nature of indirect taxes in South Africa. Now look at a country like Zambia, the last column. So what we see there is two things. The effect on poverty of the transfer system is barely existent. So you can see that from original income to disposable income, poverty rates are pretty much the same. So for some reason, the combination of transfers and direct taxes actually do not affect disposable income. This is, again, something which has to do with coverage of social protection in Zambia, but also of the fact that taxes are not sufficiently progressive in Zambia. And even more so, if you look at the last circle on the Zambia column, you see that poverty, when you consider the combination of social protection, direct taxes, and indirect taxes, is even higher. So you go from 70% poverty to almost 72% poverty. Meaning that the combination of taxes and social protection makes the poor worse off in Zambia. To me, this is a striking finding. It's a finding that says, yes, it's good that we have social protection, but that in a country like Zambia, first of all, social protection doesn't reduce poverty enough, and second of all, taxes are actually making the poor worse off. And the message I wanted to leave with you is that when we look at social protection and its overall impact on poverty and inequality, we need to look at taxes and benefits together. We cannot just focus on the benefit side. We need to look at what is the impact that the tax system also has on the poor and the vulnerable. And particularly to look at the role of indirect taxes, particularly VAT, on the poor and the vulnerable, because we know that in many developing countries, the lion's share of the tax system comes from indirect taxes. So indirect taxes play a very significant role in the overall redistribution of income. I wanted to make another point about labor market, but maybe we can come back to it.
Yeah, let's see. Let's come back to it if there's time. Great, thanks so much for that, Luca. So Luca has talked a bit about the macroeconomic picture to an extent, the kind of redistributive impact of social protection. Maxine, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about looking at the kind of macro picture from another context, more in terms of kind of what can be the potential impact of social protection on things such as citizenship, kind of social cohesion, some of the kind of political impacts of social protection, I guess. Sorry.
Right. I did mention that I would come back to this question of social protection and social accountability because there obviously there are effects on wider society of some of these new mechanisms that are being introduced into cash transfer programming to reflect and take seriously the voice of participants. So I wanted to just develop that theme around the kind of, again, let's say the sort of broader effects of these subjective changes that can take place as a result of participating in programs, being able to reintegrate again in society, but in particular in relation to social accountability and participation, to be able to transform the sort of relationship that individuals have to, say, the state, to their administrators, and indeed to themselves in the course of which they become actors rather than simply recipients of cash. So I just would like to develop that theme for a minute or two, because it can have macro political effects as well that extend beyond the kind of community level, and we have got research results in Brazil that in fact show that. So cash transfers can change the relationship between the individual to the state. And here's a couple of ways in which that happens. In the research that I did in Latin America, in the Andes, there are programs there that actually require ID cards from people to enable them to be admitted onto programs. And for many of these very poor and excluded communities, obtaining a citizenship card, an ID card, is for them quite a significant step. and it entitles them to, for example, access to health systems, to a range of things. And in the kind of qualitative responses that we got around these kinds of initiatives, people did say, well, oh, we are now citizens rather than just poor people. And it's quite interesting that the language itself reflected some of that subjective change and the abilities people had to think more broadly than outside than you know, their own communities. Another way that I think some of these programs have changed or want to change in many cases and still haven't, attitudes towards, for example, people in power, is to try to detach some of these programs from systems that are very clientelistic. And I think we all know that social protection systems in many parts of the world can be still very clientelistic. And cash transfers can both foster clientelism because people in power can distribute, for example, benefits in a quite selective manner, but they can also work against that, and they can get the message across that cash transfers are not just a kind of a gift from a powerful person or from the president. They're actually the right of the beneficiary. And of course, I think one of the pioneer states here was Mexico with the Oportunidades program, where I remember seeing these huge slogans saying, you know, the cash transfer is not a gift, it is your right. And there was quite a substantial public campaign to make that point stick with people. And the companion part of that is to give people who are recipients the right to complain if they feel that these systems are being abused and where there's forms of exclusion or forms of inclusion that they feel are inappropriate and unjust. So that is again why the participatory and social accountability work has been going on. But a sort of sub-point here is that technology, of course, can help to reduce the degree of personalism within cash transfer programs. And many people commented on the fact that they welcome that, as I mentioned earlier. But moving on to this, again, subjective transformations that people can make from, say, passive recipients to active citizens. In quite a lot of the subsequent research that I and others have done on social accountability, we found that NGOs, for example, could be very important in addressing grievances and supporting people to take collective action where there were cases of blatant exclusion and discrimination. And so that in quite a few cases you see that NGOs foster a different sense of relating to issues of justice and could be quite positive. One point I think is extremely important when we're thinking about the ability of people to take action of any kind in regard to social protection is that systems have to be transparent. People have to know what the rules are. They have to know where the money's being spent, who it's being spent on. They also need information about who is entitled. And in much of the research that both we have done and others have done, there really is inadequate information being given to beneficiaries or potential beneficiaries about the way the program works. And this is counterproductive because not only does it lead to people not coming forward or being identified, but it can also kind of foster those that sense of that the programs are not to be trusted, that they are partisan, that they're not really working in a fair and just way. If people don't know the rules, they can suspect that the rules are being misapplied. So rules are very important. People need to know them. They need to know who's in and who's out of the program. Another aspect of this which relates to the kind of broader political context, if social programming can encourage people to think of themselves as agents, as citizens, then the issue of representation is important. At what level can poor people actually make their grievances heard? And some of the more ambitious programs that have been developed in Latin America have forms of representation of poor people who are in cash transfers at various levels of administration, municipal level, even at kind of local level, where people can come forward with their views, make suggestions about how programs can be improved, put forward their grievances where they see injustices being done. So what I'm describing to you is a process, again, one might see it as a kind of a form of political spillover, sort of positive spillover that allows people to behave, you know, as citizens, to make sure that their rights are adequately served. And indeed, we do have evidence that this can lead to more political involvement by people. They begin to vote, they take an interest in politics, so there is a kind of what some people call the citizen effect of this kind of organization. And social cash transfers can actually foster some of that if they proceed in a way that actually encourages that to occur.
Thanks, Maxine. That's a great summary, I think, of the potential ways in which social protection can strengthen the relationship with the state, but also that there are perhaps a set of kind of preconditions, you know, or determining factors that can impact that. Okay, and well, finally, Jessica, you provided that really interesting case on Mexico, but it'd be great if you could provide a bit more of an overview from the broader research and work that Ideas 42 is doing of some of the impacts of those programs on kind of behavioral changes.
So I think, you know, in any policy domain, the success of the policy itself is going to be dependent on the decisions and actions of the beneficiaries, right? Beneficiaries have to decide to participate based on the cost and benefits to them. They have to decide how much to engage in the program and how much of their own personal resources to allocate to it. They have to set goals around how to participate in the program, and they have to act on those goals. And so, although the field of behavioral science is fairly new, there is some evidence that some applications of the behavioral lens and focus on human behavior in the design of programs in social protection have led to some significant impact. So I just want to share a few of those with you. I'll start with some examples in cash transfers. What we're seeing from the evidence is a few things in terms of behaviors as well as design interventions. First thing I would say is that framing and messaging happens. So we see from work done by Esther Duflo that simply labeling an unconditional cash transfer project as being an educational support program, an unconditional transfer project that is targeted towards fathers as educational support program, instead of making it a conditional cash transfer, has led to the same outcomes as a conditional cash transfer targeted towards mothers. And so it shows you that in this example that the way that the project is framed and what it's targeted for could also have impact on how the transfers are spent. Another thing that we're seeing is that timing matters. So work done by Paul Niehaus coming out of Kenya has shown that the timing, the frequency of the cash transfers, as well as even giving beneficiaries the option to decide the optimal timing of their transfers, has led to more intentional use of their funds. One more example, idea that I want to share with you in terms of cash transfers is that the mindset of beneficiaries at the timing of receiving the transfers has shown from the evidence from behavioral science to have impact on how the funds are spent. And so some of the work that we've done at Ideas 42 in Madagascar in terms of planning and self-affirmation activities implemented before women in a human development cash transfers project receive their cash has also shown to improve the intentional use of funds. And so I'll move on to talk a little bit about some of the evidence that we're seeing in terms of labor programs and labor assistance programs and the ways that behavioral tools and the behavioral lens have led to impact in those programs and boosted impacts in those programs. And so we see from the literature that plan making in South Africa, just a simple act of plan making in terms of your job search during unemployment, has led to more efficient and more effective job searching, which has led to better outcomes in employment. We've also seen around training, which is often a big issue in terms of micro-entrepreneurship training, in terms of the burden that it might they might put on entrepreneurs in terms of the time they have to invest, the complexity of the content. We see that research coming out of Togo has shown that putting a psychology lens on the training, as well as focusing on personal initiatives, has in fact increased profits for entrepreneurs through that behavioral lens. I'll end with one last example coming out of our work at Ideas 42 in terms of financial heuristics. And so this is similar in terms of the way that we frame trainings. And so building on some of those behavioral barriers that I mentioned before in terms of training for micro-entrepreneurs, we saw that behaviorally informed mobile-based micro-entrepreneurship training increased sales for firms in both India and the Philippines. So this training was crafted around interactive voice recordings where entrepreneurs were able to receive short lessons with rules of thumb, with heuristics on basic accounting, on basic ideas on how to partition their funds from their businesses away from their home investments, and led to increased sales and revenue for the firms. And so I think this shows you that the research is new, but there's some evidence coming out in terms of low-cost interventions that are behaviorally informed can create some impact for social protection programs.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I mean, I think as Jessica explained and Josh did yesterday as well, this is quite a kind of new, seems a relatively new area of exploration. So it's great to get a sense of that, some of the kind of freshest, newest evidence coming out on those impacts. Okay, Charles, could we put those questions on this screen? So we had a number of questions come through from the Slido. What I thought is maybe while our panelists can have a look at some of the top questions that have come through and have a think about them, I also thought that it would be good maybe just to give the opportunity if anyone in the amongst yourselves wants to, I guess, either do one of two things. Either wants to kind of share a question that they couldn't quite articulate in the Slido, or perhaps actually if somebody here has an experience of working on analysing the impact of social protection themselves and want to kind of share that experience of what they found or what they've seen in their own country. So do we have any volunteers? Anyone want to share a question or a thought? If not, we can come back to this in a moment. Okay, great. Have a think about it. Okay, so here are some of the questions that have come through. I'm going to really kind of leave it open to our panel to answer those that interest them most. I mean, I guess one of the top ones that I think has been addressed a little bit, but I don't know if anyone wants to kind of elaborate on it a little bit more, is around the criteria for determining the beneficiaries, so the kind of targeting mechanisms. I mean, it would be interesting maybe to clarify what are some of the targeting mechanisms used in some of the different programs we're talking about, and what the experiences that you might have had of how the targeting mechanism, how the identification of beneficiaries can affect impacts. Does anyone want to take up that question? Or similarly, and I'm not sure if it's here, but there was another question which I thought was quite relevant as well, which was it'd be mentioned about the minimum. What is the minimum benefit level? What's a reasonable benefit level? How do we define that? So do we have anyone who wants to kick off?
Okay, so maybe I can start with the minimum benefit level, because that is one of the areas that we've done a lot of work, that how much transfer do you have to give to a household in order to expect certain impact. So when we talk of cash transfer, it tends to have this idea that it's one fixed thing. Cash transfer is this. But different cash transfer programs have different levels of transfer. And also some of them are fixed, some of them are indexed to the household size. So if you have 1-member, 2-member households, you get different amounts. Some of them it's a fixed amount for regardless of the household size. Some transfer programs will give a bonus for every child that you put in school. Some programs will give a bonus for every child who is less than 4 years old, and so on and so forth. From our experience, to have very transformative impacts of the cash transfer program, you need to be giving the household about minimum of 20% above their baseline expenditure. So for example, if you have a household which has an expenditure of $10, then to see any impact, you should be giving about 20% of that more in order to expect any impact. When governments pretend to do the socially desirable by also starting cash transfer programs and giving amounts that are next to nothing, and which also loses its value over time, it's not indexed against inflation. So for 4 years, the amount of the transfer remains the same. It's not indexed against inflation. Then you don't see the transformative impacts that you expect when programs are giving at least 20% of the baseline consumption to these households, and also indexing it against inflation so that it keeps its real value. So that's kind of a rule of thumb, 20% of baseline consumption if you want to have these transformative impacts of the cash transfer programs. So I think that's what our research suggests, and that's our recommendation to a lot of these government-run cash transfer programs in Africa. I don't know if...
Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, I thought maybe I could share some thoughts on the issue of targeting. To mention that if you look at, let's say, specifically social cash transfers or cash transfers around the world, there are sort of two primary classes of targeting or approaches to selecting beneficiaries. Targeting modalities which are primarily poverty focused, with a focus on poverty, and targeting modalities which are more focused on, let's say, what we call categorical targeting. It kind of puts more emphasis on specific groups of population in society that are perceived as deserving to receive transfers. And I want to spend just a few words on each of these two approaches. So poverty targeting is very common. Most of the cash transfers in Latin America, but also in Africa, have elements of poverty targeting. In countries where you don't have developed or kind of reliable data on incomes, most programs rely on what we call means testing. So it's basically an observation of assets that households have and some sort of determination of the poverty status of households based on the assets they own. Now, this has come, it's currently at the center of a very intense debate globally as to whether means testing works and, is effective. I think particularly in Africa, there's been a lot of discussion as to whether, means testing and the focus on poverty is the way to go. There are a couple of challenges with poverty targeting, particularly in Africa. One is that poverty levels are very high. So it becomes sort of an exercise of differentiating between those who are a little bit more poor and less poor, and that it's always complex. It leads to very high errors of inclusion and exclusion. Proxy means testing have proven to be very inaccurate, particularly when your aim is to really identify the poorest of the poor. The other element is that poverty is very dynamic, so you have a lot of movements in and out of poverty. I think some evidence from Zambia showing that about 50% move across the poverty line from a year to the other. So then it becomes very difficult to lock beneficiaries in or out of the program, depending on the poverty observation you may do on a specific point in time when you know that many of those households are actually quite mobile across the poverty line. And the third one is not necessarily these approaches, such as the means testing, are easily understandable by communities. So I think there's a lot of evidence from qualitative research showing that communities are often a bit puzzled as to what happens when a means testing is introduced. I remember some quotes from work in Lesotho where they say, we don't know, the data goes in a computer and then the outcome comes back to us. So there is an issue of transparency and the extent to which communities actually understand the dynamics behind poverty targeting. If you even, look at some of the recent debate within the World Bank, because of these very reasons, even the World Bank is now taking a much stronger stance in favor of more universal targeting, or kind of reducing the stress or the focus on poverty targeting as the only way to select beneficiaries in transfers. The other option is more categorical transfers, which really look at categories in societies that, because of the vulnerability profile that they face, are considered as needing support through transfers. And this takes different forms, of course, the elderly, persons living with disability, in some cases vulnerable children. It's an approach which is generally more understandable by communities. It is simpler to implement, it is less expensive. Poverty targeting can be quite expensive. If you have to collect data, process data through sort of household surveys, that actually requires quite a lot of information, whereas categorical targeting could be based on more simply observable demographic characteristics and can piggyback on identification, systems and kind of civil registry information, etc. But it also has its own drawbacks. I think the main one being that there's a tendency to give priority to those groups which we sometimes call the deserving poor. So again, groups that society, because of cultural, cultural background, considers as needing social protection. And this often leads to a situation where, for example, children are not sufficiently covered, because in many countries there is still quite a strong resistance to, for example, to provide cash transfers to adults who have labor capacity. And that leads to a situation where, for example, in many countries we see that the share of children, poor children covered by transfers, is still very, very low. So there are really these two schools of thoughts. And the other one is whether to focus households on individuals, which is another interesting discussion. If you have questions, maybe we could discuss that.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the question around the minimum amount for beneficiaries. I would say from this perspective that I would encourage you to think about the cost to the beneficiaries of receiving the transfer in that calculation, and thinking about how can we design programs that empower beneficiaries to achieve their goals and reduce the cost to them in actually receiving the transfers in the case of cash transfers. So in terms of thinking of things like the cost, such as the amount of time invested into being able to meet the requirements of the program, or transportation costs, as well as time around transportation to be able to go to the delivery point to be able to access the transfer, and thinking about some of the design elements of the delivery mechanisms in delivering the cash, and how that either creates a burden for the beneficiaries or empowers them to be able to use the cash in the ways that they intend for higher incomes in terms of their goals.
Well, I think some excellent points have already been made. I would only just add about the minimum issue. I think most of the research shows that if you really want to bring about positive change that helps people move out of poverty, you need to be a bit more generous. I mean, if resources allow, because the more generous the grant, the more likelihood there is that savings and multiplier effects, both economic and social, will actually result. So I think, a lot of governments are worried about creating dependency and so on and so forth. As Frank said, this really isn't the case. What tends to happen is people, if they do get a grant and that enables them to save, they save and they invest in their assets. They buy cows, they buy productive goods. So I think that's the main point that I wanted to make.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. I think we're coming to the end of the time we have for the session. So I maybe just wanted to flag there are a few questions up there that haven't been answered. I think a number of them are things which I'd encourage you to continue to raise in the different sessions and electives, because I think there's going to be moments where a lot of them are addressed, specifically questions of financial literacy, fiscal space. They're going to be and this question of kind of dependency, and I think you'll find will be quite recurrent themes over the coming days. For the top question about retirement village and national insurance policy, at least from my perspective, I think I'll be interested to understand a little bit more what the thinking is behind that specific proposal, because I'm not sure the language may be clear to everyone. So I'd encourage that person to come and talk to some resource people or others, or continue to explore that, because it sounds like something that could be discussed further. Okay, but with that, I have a few administrative points to mention at the end of the session. But for now, I'd really just like to thank our panel for sharing all of their insights, and thank you as well for engaging so proactively with the questions and trying to extract as much as possible out of our panel. So brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay, fantastic. So maybe if we switch over to the PowerPoint again. There are just a few things before the end of the session that I wanted to mention before we go to the break. And I will just find so this will be less interest for those joining by the live stream, but I'll mention anyway. Okay, so first of all, you should have been selected your electives for the next for the coming week, both for the morning sessions and for the afternoon sessions. Now, it'd be good if you could all look at your agendas and just check one thing. What you should have is that for the first 3 days, you should have one elective chosen, and then for the wrap-up, you should have a different one. So I think, as Charles mentioned yesterday, you will follow one elective for 3 days, and then for the wrap-up, you'll go to a different one. So, perhaps you'll go to course 1 for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then say, okay, for the wrap-up, for the summary session, I just want to go to course 4, for example. So if any of you have the same course for both Tuesday to Thursday and for the wrap-up on Friday, then please come and talk to us to amend that, because they should be different. So that's just one thing to check. Just in terms of logistics, from the next session, we will be in those electives. And just to point you in the right direction, course 1, 3 and 4 are all in this building. Course 1 is in this room. Course 3 and 4 downstairs, so it should be relatively easy to find in the Piedmont building. Course 2 and 5 are in the Africa building, which is, when you walk out the door of the building, it's effectively opposite. You kind of walk into a courtyard and you can find the rooms Africa 92 and 94. And there will be the same rooms for the morning, afternoon. Obviously, different courses will be in different places. But you can look and see exactly where those are. 2 additional things I just wanted to mention. This evening, we have the first major social event of the Academy, which is a barbecue, which starts at 6:30 in the Valentino bar, which will be a barbecue, which is, always quite a special moment, and the first kind of real moment to come together socially as a group in the Academy. It's an opportunity to enjoy a barbecue in a warm Italian evening. So yes, please come along to that. We hope to see you there. And now the final thing relates to this break. So what we're going to have now is we're going to have the group photo for the course, which, as Irene mentioned yesterday, will be a memento that you can all take home to your countries to remember the academy. So it's very important. We will not now go to coffee. We will go for the photo. You'll be guided. There will be various people who will point you in the right direction, and we will go and have that photo taken. And then after the photo, we'll go to the coffee in the normal place. And then once the coffee's finished at 10:30, you'll go to your electives and begin the elective courses. Okay, is that all? Are there any questions that people might have? Any points for clarification? Okay, well then I will assume all is clear. And so looking